There is a knife in a kitchen drawer in 10,000 American houses that cost 50 cents, and outworked everything ever sold to replace it. It skinned the deer, and it sharpened the boy's pencil. It dressed the Thanksgiving hog and pried the stone from a boot heel. And when the man who bought it died, it did not go into the ground with him. It went to his son. Nobody wrote its name in a will. Nobody had to. It was handed across a kitchen table, the way the important things were, in a country that still built its tools to be kept. This is the story of 18 of those blades, the knives American men carried into the woods, and of the quiet moment a nation of keepers became a nation that throws things away. They were cheap, and they were precious. Made of plain carbon steel, a man could sharpen on the bottom of a coffee mug and built to last 3 generations. Almost every one of them has slipped off the shelves it once ruled, and almost every one died the same quiet death. Count them down, from 18 to 1, and watch it happen. Number 18. The Old Hickory Butcher knife never asked to be a hunting knife. It was born in a kitchen drawer. The Ontario Knife Company, up in Franklinville, New York, stamped these plain carbon steel blades with riveted hardwood handles and sold them for about 50 cents in the 1930s. As bread knives, as paring knives, as the thing a grandmother used to cut a chicken. But a farmer needed a blade the morning a buck came down out of the timber, and the old hickory was already there, wrapped in an oil rag behind the truck seat. The steel was soft enough to sharpen on a stone and hard enough to hold an edge through an afternoon of hard work. It patinaed to a dull gray, and nobody babied it because it cost pennies and did the job of a knife costing $5. It butchered hogs in November and sliced apples in September. And here is the thing the catalogs never printed. The cheapest knife in the house was, more often than not, the most useful one in it. It still is. It survives in toolboxes and in the memory of men who learned that truth young. Number 17. The Barlow rode in more American pockets than any blade before or since. The first knife a boy was ever handed, and the last one a working man ever set down. Born in England, made famous in America, it was the cheap, sturdy jackknife with the long bolster you could buy for a dime through the Sears, Roebuck catalog. By the early 1900s, nearly every farm boy in the country owned one, traded for one, or whittled with one on the schoolhouse steps. It was the knife Tom Sawyer carried. It was the knife a grandfather pressed into a small hand with 3 words. Don't cut toward yourself. In the deer woods, it dressed small game, cut twine, and lanced a blister. Boys earned their first Barlow through a whole season of chores, then carried it until the blade was honed down to a sliver. And its cheapness, in the end, was its undoing. When stamped stainless multi-tools and disposable utility blades filled the registers, the honest single-blade jackknife became a relic. But every man who ever owned one remembers the weight of it, because his whole world once fit in his front pocket. Number 16. Some knives carry a name that was never really about knives at all. After the First World War, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company of New Haven, Connecticut, found itself with empty factories and idle machines. The government arms contracts had dried up, so the company that helped arm the West went looking for something else to build, and in 1919 it started making pocket knives, buying up the Eagle Knife Company and the old Napanock Works to do it. Its motto was blunt and confident, a knife as good as the gun, and for a while, it was. A Winchester folding hunter, with jigged bone handles and that famous name on the tang, went into coat pockets and deer camps all across the country. But a gun company making knives to fill a slow decade is a fragile thing. The Great Depression drove the price down, and the quality down with it. Winchester itself went into receivership in 1931 and was bought out by the Allen family's cartridge company. And by 1942, with a new war on, Winchester quietly stopped making knives and turned its machines back to rifles. The name still gleams on the blade. The company that meant it is long gone. Number 15. Say its name right, because almost nobody does. Cattaraugus, not Kabar, though the two get confused to this day. The Cattaraugus 225Q was built in Little Valley, New York, in a town so thick with knife factories they called it the Village of Knives. During the Second World War, the company turned out this heavy quartermaster's blade for the armed forces. The Q stood for quartermaster, and it was rugged beyond reason. a 6-inch clip-point blade thick enough to pry open an ammunition crate, a stacked red fiber and leather handle, a pommel a soldier could drive like a hammer. When the boys came home in 1945, the .225Q came home with them, stuffed in a duffel bag, and a war surplus example could be had for $1 or $2. It was almost too much knife for a whitetail. But a generation raised in the Depression never threw away anything that still worked, and so the blade that had seen the Pacific spent its retirement dressing venison on frosty November mornings. Today, it turns up in shadow boxes. A knife that carried 2 histories, war and the woods, in a single piece of American steel. Number 14. If you were an American boy in the middle of the century, there is a good chance the first real knife you owned said Camillus on the blade. And an even better chance you never gave the company a second thought. Camillus Cutlery, of Camillus, New York, was the quiet giant of the American knife trade. From 1947, it made the official folding knife of the Boy Scouts of America. The 4-blade utility knife with the bail on the end, the one that hung from a lanyard on 10 million uniforms. A scout learned to whittle with it, to cut a fresh length of rope, to earn a merit badge with it. It cost a few dollars, and it taught a boy how to handle a blade without losing a finger. But remember the name Camillus, because we are going to meet it again before this countdown is over. And when we do, you are going to learn that the most famous fighting knife in American history was mostly built by this company, and hardly anyone ever knew. Camillus made knives for more than 130 years. It closed its doors, for good, in 2007, number 13. The Western sheath knife came down out of the Colorado Rockies with pine pitch and gun oil worked into its leather. But its roots ran back east, to a family named Platts. Sheffield-trained cutlers who had helped build the knife trade of upstate New York before one of them, in failing health, sold his stake in a company you will recognize by the end of this list and moved west to Boulder in 1911. There he started Western States Cutlery. Through the 1950s, a Western sheath knife sold for around $3. Cheap enough for a ranch hand, tough enough for an elk camp at 10,000 feet. Its stacked leather handle warmed in the hand and never went slick with blood, and the company stamped each blade with a date code so a man could read the very year his father bought his. It was, in the truest sense, a knife made to be handed down. And it was handed down. Right up until foreign imports undercut American cutlery, the factory moved, changed hands, and was finally folded into another company that then went under itself. The leather darkens now in the backs of gun safes. The steel is still sharp. Number 12. Some knives tell you how to use them right there in the name. Kinfolks. Made in that same little town of Little Valley, New York, by craftsmen who had learned the trade in the great cutlery families of the Northeast, Kinfolks turned out honest fixed-blade hunting knives through the middle of the century. Carbon steel blades, stacked leather or stag handles, sold for a few dollars in hardware stores. A father bought one for himself and a smaller one for his son, and the two of them walked into the woods together, the boy learning to dress his first squirrel under his father's eye. The name was the whole idea. A knife that belonged to a lineage, not to a season. But a name cannot save a company. As the Little Valley factories closed one by one and cheaper imports flooded the shelves, Kinfolks disappeared almost without anyone noticing. Today its knives turn up at estate sales, their leather handles worn smooth by hands long gone. The name still promising the one thing the modern market forgot, that a knife could be kin. Number 11. The Sharpfinger was the strange little skinner that landed in nearly every deer hunter's hand in the 1970s. Schrade Cutlery introduced it in 1973. An unmistakable upswept blade with a deep, hooked point, shaped for exactly one job, sliding under the hide of a whitetail without ever nicking the meat. It sold for around $10, came in a snap-strap sheath, and its molded handle was stamped old-timer, with that familiar shield. Sporting goods stores stacked them by the hundreds every autumn, and a generation of young men learned to skin a deer with that funny hooked blade. For many of them, the first hunting knife they ever bought with their own money. Then, in 2004, after a full century of making knives in the United States, Schrade filed for bankruptcy, closed its factory, and the name was sold off to be stamped on blades made overseas. The imports look like the original. They are not the original. A genuine, American-made Sharpfinger is a prize at a flea market now. The odd little hooked blade, a relic of the autumn when nearly every truck in the lot had one riding on the dash. Number 10. Not every knife on this list came out of the old cutlery towns of the East. One came from an advertising man in Portland, Oregon. In 1939, Joseph Gerber mailed 24 sets of handmade knives to his best clients as Christmas gifts. And when the outfitter Abercrombie & Fitch got hold of a set and asked for more, Gerber Legendary Blades was born. After the war, his sons turned the family's eye for marketing toward the hunter, and by 1948 the company put out its first purpose-built hunting knife, a compact fixed blade called the Shorty. A Gerber came in a presentation box that felt like a gift even when you bought it for yourself, and it was the kind of blade a man handed to a son who had finally grown into it. And here's the quiet grace note. Gerber is still in Portland, still making knives. 2 of its own workers left and went on to found famous knife companies of their own. It is one of the few names on this list that did not die. Proof that an American knife company could survive the century if it kept its nerve and kept its name. Number 9. In the 1920s, the Remington Arms Company, famous the world over for its ammunition, did exactly what its rival Winchester had done, and for exactly the same reason: idle factories after the First World War. Remington started making pocket knives, and it stamped them with a shield shaped like a cartridge. The largest of its folding hunters earned a name straight out of the catalog of the gun: the bullet knife. The blade locked open with authority. The jigged bone handle filled the hand, and that little cartridge shield gleamed against the dark bone like a promise. The same name on a man's rifle, faithfully on the knife in his pocket. It sold for $1 or $2, and a serious hunter saved for one, then carried it for 30 years. But in 1940, as the world tilted toward war, Remington turned every machine it had back to the war effort, and the original bullet knife vanished almost overnight. For decades afterward, those pre-war blades passed quietly from fathers to sons. Today, an original Remington bullet is among the most sought-after folders America ever made. A knife from the brief, strange decade when a gun company also lived in your pocket. Number 8. When a wilderness guide in the North Woods needed one knife to do everything, he reached for the Marble's Woodcraft. Introduced in 1915 by the Marble Company of Gladstone, Michigan, the Woodcraft came close to perfect. A wide, deep-bellied clip-point blade ground for skinning, a stacked leather handle, an aluminum pommel. The broad belly peeled hide from a deer in long, clean strokes. The fine point stayed delicate enough for close work. It was the professional's choice, the knife of the trapper and the canoe country hunter. And the Boy Scouts of America thought so highly of it that they named it their official knife through the 1930s. It sold for around $2, and it earned that price every single season. But watch what happens to the best ideas in American manufacturing. Marble's own patents ran out in the 1920s, and cheaper makers copied the design and undersold the original. The competition wore the company down slowly, for decades, until the Woodcraft slipped from production and from memory. Today, an original is a treasure. Its deep-bellied blade is a reminder of an era when American knife makers built tools for men who lived by them. Number 7. Number 7 rode west with the mountain men and helped carve a nation into being. John Russell's Green River Works, on the Green River in Massachusetts, began turning out simple, thin-bladed carbon steel knives in the 1830s, and they became the standard tool of the entire fur trade, shipped by the thousands to the rendezvous camps of the Rocky Mountains. A trapper could buy one for a few cents, and with it he skinned beaver, butchered buffalo, ate his supper, and defended his life. The blades were so good and so common that a phrase entered the American language. To do a thing all the way, completely, was to do it up to Green River, right up to the maker's mark stamped near the handle. The Plains tribes traded furs for them. The whole opening of the West passed through their edges. The steel was plain and the design was humble, but it was reliable in a country where a dull or broken knife could cost a man his life. When the fur trade collapsed and the frontier closed, the Green River faded from daily use, surviving now among the buckskinners who keep the old skills alive. It may be the single most historically important hunting knife America ever made. Number 6. No knife in America was ever more of an heirloom in waiting than a case. W.R. Case & Sons of Bradford, Pennsylvania, built its name on bone and stag handles, long pull blades, and that double X stamp that promised double-tempered steel. And it built its business, whether it meant to or not, on a single ritual. Through the middle of the century, a case fixed-blade hunter, or a big case folder, was the gift a boy received the year he was finally judged old enough to hunt, often for around $5, often with his initials scratched into the sheath. The blades took a fine edge and held it. The handles glowed amber with age, and the dating system stamped on every tang let a man read the very year his knife was born. This was not a knife you used up. This was a knife you inherited. The knife historian Brad Lockwood, who wrote the definitive history of the case cutlery dynasty, has traced how thoroughly this one family's blades wove themselves into American life. The company still endures. But the universal deer camp case, the one on every belt and every truck, has largely passed into memory, cherished now by the families who still remember whose hands first carried it. Number 5. In 1964, a small California company changed the American knife forever, and then quietly stepped down from the throne it had built. The Buck 110 folding hunter was a heavy lockback with a clip-point blade, brass bolsters, and rich ebony or walnut handles. And it did something no folder had done before. It gave a hunter the strength of a fixed blade and something that closed safely into a belt pouch. At around $10 or $12, it was not cheap, and it did not sell fast. Buck moved fewer than 300 of them that first year. And then it caught fire. And by the late 1960s, nearly every serious hunter in the country wanted one riding on his hip in that snap-flap sheath. It was so completely dominant that Americans began calling any folding hunter a buck knife, the way they said Kleenex or thermos. The company still makes it today, in Idaho. Another survivor. But the years when the 110 ruled every belt in America are gone. It stands now as the last great icon of the leather sheath era, the folding hunter an entire generation of American men carried into the woods. Before we reach the top 4, a gift. Everything in this countdown. Every maker. Every town, the year a factory opened and the year it went dark. The prices, the patterns, the specs of every blade that mattered, is pulled together into a one-page field guide you can keep. Point your phone at the code on the screen, and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay right here, because the number 4 knife on this list carries a secret that fooled almost everyone who ever owned one, including, maybe, your own grandfather. Number 4. The Ka-Bar came home from the war and never stopped working. It was born as the United States Marine Corps fighting and utility knife of the Second World War. A 7-inch clip-point blade, a stacked leather handle, a steel guard. And its very name is a piece of American folklore. The company that trademarked it, Union Cutlery of Olin, New York, said the name came from a fur trapper's letter, thanking them for a knife he had used to kill a wounded bear after his rifle jammed. Kill a bear. Ka-Bar. When the boys came home in 1945, the knife went straight into the deer woods, and a generation dressed its venison with the same blade that had crossed the Pacific. But here is the secret this knife kept for 80 years. The Ka-Bar that men revere, the one in the shadow box on the den wall, was mostly not made by Ka-Bar at all. The first military contract, and the largest number of these knives produced during the entire war, came from a company we already met tonight, Camillus, the quiet giant, which turned out more than 1 million of them. The name on the blade became the legend. The company that actually built most of them never got the credit. That, more than anything, is the story of the American knife. Number 3. Some men saved for a year to own number 3. Beginning in the late 1930s, in a small shop in Orlando, Florida, a man named Randall and a handful of craftsmen forged knives one at a time. Tool steel, hand-ground, fitted with stacked leather or stag. You did not buy a Randall off a shelf. You ordered one, and you waited months for it to arrive in the mail. It was never cheap. It cost many times what a hardware store blade did, but a Randall was a knife for life. Balanced, beautiful, and sharper than anything a factory could match. Soldiers carried them through the Second World War and through Vietnam. Hunters who could afford one treated it like an heirloom from the moment it came out of the box. To own one was to belong to a quiet brotherhood of men who understood what a knife could be, and the very thing that made it precious, the slow work of the human hand, is the thing that kept it rare. As mass production swallowed the market, The handmade hunting knife became something most men only ever read about. The Randall shop still works today, but the world that prized that kind of patience has mostly vanished. Number 2. Long before any of these, there was the blade that gave the American knife its swagger. The Bowie knife was born in legend. In the enormous knife Jim Bowie is said to have wielded in the bloody sandbar fight of 1827 and carried to his death at the Alamo in 1836. From that story came the defining American big knife, a long clip-point blade with a guard, equally at home in a hunt, a fight, or a hard day on the frontier. For decades, it was the knife every man on the edge of civilization wanted on his hip, used to butcher game, clear brush, skin a bear. Frontier blacksmiths and English cutlery firms alike turned them out by the thousands, and a good Bowie could cost anywhere from $1 to a small fortune. The knife historian Bernard Levine, whose guide to knife values is the standard reference for collectors, has spent a career separating the real history of these blades from the tall tales. And with the Bowie, the tale and the truth are almost impossible to pull apart. As the frontier closed and lighter, purpose-built hunting knives took over. The great Bowie retreated into legend, but its shadow still falls across every blade on this list. Number 1. And finally, in first place, the knife that invented the American hunting knife as we know it. Designed by Webster Marble of Gladstone, Michigan, and introduced right around the turn of the 20th century, the Ideal was the first blade built from the ground up purely for the hunter. Before it, men went into the woods with butcher knives, trade knives, and converted kitchen blades. Marble gave them a deep-bellied clip point with a finger guard, a stacked leather handle, and a balance that made skinning and field dressing almost effortless. And he popularized the stacked leather handle that half the knives on this list would go on to borrow. After the Ideal, every American hunting knife that followed, the Western, the Case, the Buck, the Sharpfinger, owed something to its shape. It sold for a few dollars through the great mail-order catalogs, and it set the standard the whole industry would chase for the next 100 years. But even the knife that started it all could not outrun the pattern. Marble's own patents expired, cheaper copies crowded the shelves, and eventually the founding father of the American hunting knife slipped quietly from production. Today, an original Marble's Ideal is the crown jewel of any collection, the first of a line that every other blade on this list descended from. From the 50-cent Old Hickory in the kitchen drawer to the Marble's Ideal that started it all, these 18 knives tell one story, told 18 times. The story of how American men met the woods, one honest blade at a time. They were cheap and they were precious, made of plain carbon steel and built to be handed down. And nearly every one of them slipped from the shelves it once ruled, in the same quiet way, when a country that once made things to keep learned instead to make things to throw away. I have held a carbon steel blade older than my grandfather, felt where 100 sharpenings had worn the edge thin, and understood for the first time that it was never really about the steel. It was about the hand that meant to pass it on. If a knife like that still means something to you, if you remember the weight of one in your own pocket, then you already belong here. Subscribe, and stand with the people who refuse to let these names be forgotten. And leave the name of the one your grandfather carried in the comments. Some of us are still out here, keeping the old steel sharp.